Hello everyone, today I'm going to be reviewing the scenario Paper Chase from the Call of Cthulhu starter set. In this scenario, an investigator is requested to look into a recent burglary that has occurred in Arnoldsburg, Michigan. Specifically, a young man living in his missing uncle's home has recently discovered that a number of books have been stolen without obvious signs of a break-in having occurred. Will the players be able to figure out who has stolen the books? And does this burglary have something to do with the missing uncle? I'm gonna review this scenario and offer my advice for those planning to run it. So if you're looking to play this scenario, you're gonna want to stop the video here and direct whoever's running it for you this way. If you're running it, stay right where you are, because I'm going to break things down for you and discuss who this scenario is going to be good for, what kind of players might like it, and what its potential weaknesses might be. Alright, so first things first, this scenario is set in a completely unique location. It's in the small town of Arnoldsburg, Michigan, by default. If you would rather relocate it to wherever your ongoing campaign is occurring, that's not going to be a problem. The specific setting of the scenario does not matter, as long as you are able to locate the Kimball house relatively proximate to a cemetery in a reasonably well-to-do neighborhood. It is nice that by default it is set in Arnoldsburg, in my opinion. It's just a different area of the U.S. that not a lot of scenarios, or really any scenarios that I'm aware of, are set in. And it can offer your investigator a potential fun little road trip to get there from where they probably are somewhere in New England. In terms of the hook for the scenario, there are two hooks offered. Either the investigators somehow know Thomas Kimball. When I ran this, the investigator who I ran it for, I made Thomas Kimball a former employee of her father, who ran a construction company, and the two were familiar with each other. You could also have Thomas Kimball be an old university friend, an old friend who moved out west for perhaps financial reasons. He is, after all, living in his uncle's house, so maybe he doesn't have a ton of money. There are options there. If you're planning to run this scenario and you have some time to introduce Thomas Kimball before having him move away, I think that would be all the better. But if you don't, it's not a problem to work Thomas into someone's backstory. If you're running this out of the starter set, then it does also come with an investigative organization. None of the pre-generated characters have particularly strong ties to the scenario as written, but they do have membership in the Society for the Exploration of the Unexplained, an investigative organization, and that society should give them plenty of motivation to look into this unexplained occurrence of where these books have gone and what is going on in Arnoldsburg. Now, what is going on in this scenario is that Douglas Kimball, Thomas Kimball's uncle, whose home he's living in, has decided he's weary of the world of humanity and human responsibilities. He has encountered ghouls at the cemetery that he would always read his books at. He was a little bit of an eccentric fellow. And he's decided he'd like to become a ghoul. That means that this is kind of a scenario without an antagonist, as written. That can be a refreshing change of pace, but it also means that there's not a particularly strong horror atmosphere throughout this scenario. Alright, so because Douglas was always reading his books at the nearby cemetery, it's important that his home be located near the cemetery if you are moving the scenario to a new location. As written, Douglas's home is right next to the cemetery. Arnoldsburg is a pretty self-contained small town. The recommendation is that this is a scenario for one player. And that's just because there's not a great deal for the investigator to do and interact with, and it's also a scenario that's very low in terms of lethality, unless your player makes some very poor choices. There's a number of NPCs that are offered to flesh out Arnoldsburg. There's the neighbor, the elderly lady, Lila Odell, who cares about appearance and social standing, but she doesn't really have very much useful information beyond observing that he was always hanging out at the cemetery and reading his books. There's Thomas Kimball, who likewise does not have a great deal of relevant information, but he is the hook into the scenario. He will allow the investigator to stay at his uncle's home, which he is living in ever since his uncle went missing. And he's able to indicate where relevant areas to look around in the home may be. For example, the study where the missing books are. He's not sure what the books were, but also where an important clue, which is Douglas Kimball's journal, can be found. And if your player's struggling to find it, Thomas can prompt them, oh, I think my uncle's journal is in here. Maybe there'll be something in there of use. There's the alcoholic gravekeeper, who has turned to the bottle due to the unsettling occurrences that he has observed around the cemetery. He has a little bit more information. He can point out where in particular in the cemetery it was that Douglas liked to read. And he can, under some social pressure, admit that things are not quite right in the cemetery. You have an unnamed police desk officer who can provide very basic clues to the effect that there are some older noise reports related to the cemetery, but the police have not found anything there. And then finally, as with any good Call of Cthulhu scenario, you have the local newspaper where research will turn up strange stories related to what's going on. Here you have the local editor, Artie Malloy. Not a great deal of information is given about him, unfortunately, by the scenario, but you can play him as you see fit. And there are several clues in the backlogs or the archives of the Arnoldsburg Advertiser, namely that naked people have been seen cavorting around the cemetery at night from a distance, and that an old lady who used to live in the area and has since moved to Detroit claims she saw some kind of monsters in the cemetery one night. In addition to all these clues, Douglas Kimball's journal, which can be found in his study, in which Thomas Kimball can point out to struggling investigators, denotes how Douglas was growing weary of life in human society and had reached a decision to join his friends below, whatever that entails. All of this should point your investigator pretty clearly in the direction of the cemetery. Pretty much every interaction, every clue in this scenario suggests the cemetery has something to do with strange things that are going on in the town, and those strange things would probably explain the burglary, because there are no recent robberies in the town, and the only robber, if the players talk to the police, they will learn that the only robber in the area has been arrested some time ago and is in fact in jail at present. Once your investigator, if they do decide to go to the cemetery and look around, there's a pretty clear clue path for them there as well. If they talk to Melodius Jefferson, he can point out where Douglas's favorite tombstone is. From there, they should be able to find a set of strange kind of hoof-like marks leading from that tombstone to a mausoleum, which in turn leads to tunnels beneath Arnoldsburg. It is written that if the investigator unwisely opens the door to the mausoleum without covering their mouth, there is kind of toxic miasma just from the corpses within that comes out and is incredibly powerful and knocks them unconscious. I think that's fine. I think that is going to show your players that they need to think through what they're doing. This is probably a scenario you're running early on and for a player relatively new to the game. So I think that's fine. It's teaching them, think through what you're doing in Call of Cthulhu. What I'm not a huge fan of is that, as written, the scenario recommends that if they do pass out in this way, They wake up at night many hours later, and Douglas Kimball, as a partially transformed ghoul, is kind of sitting over top of them, staring at them. Yes, that is immediately kind of creepy, but if your player was actively investigating and following the correct trail of clues, and then at this crucial moment as they're about to go down into the tunnels and kind of complete the investigative work that they've been doing throughout the scenario, you just take that away from them and just jump to the climax. I think that's going to be unrewarding for most players, and is also denying you the opportunity to get your player down into the tunnels, have them potentially get lost, play up the creepy atmosphere in that regard with strange shapes and noises in nearby tunnels. So I think if I was to run this, and when I did run this, I did not use that as written. I just had the investigator wake up an hour later, and it was still daylight and there was still time to do stuff. You could also have Melodious Jefferson find them as he's doing his duties during the day in the graveyard, and have him bring them too. Once they do get Douglas out, they can either choose to fight him, or they can choose to have a conversation with him. Investigators with any level of humanity are probably going to choose to talk with him and see what's going on, and he's just going to say, basically, what's going on. That he doesn't really like living with humans, that he just wants to read his books all the time, and that by being a ghoul, he can do so undisturbed. This does present an interesting dilemma of, are the investigators going to confront him about stealing the books? Is it even stealing? They were his books when he was a human. Is the investigator okay that he's seemingly turning into this kind of monstrous thing that does have to survive off meat, but he is eating dead bodies, so he's not strictly harming anyone? So there's some interesting moral dilemmas there, and it represents a nice way to for a player to potentially get a feel for what their new character is like, or just it's interesting moral quandaries to present to an existing character as well. If your player chooses to fight Douglas, they'll probably be able to overpower him. He is kind of an older man. He's only partially transformed into a ghoul, and he will only attack them with melee attacks because he's not carrying around weapons, and really he just wants to get his books and run away and not get killed by an aggressive investigator. While this setup, in terms of there not being really a true antagonist and there not being really a great threat to the investigators, is nice insofar as there's a low level of lethality, there's a high level of mystery and intrigue, and there's a strong sense of investigation throughout the scenario. As I've said, there's never really a strong element of horror, with perhaps the brief exception of if your player chooses to go down into the dark tunnels and hears the other ghouls kind of nearby. But then they're probably going to see Douglas at some point in the tunnels, or they're going to see Douglas going up to read in the graveyard, or they're going to see Douglas going up to retrieve more books, and they're going to be able to follow him out of the tunnels, because you don't want them to permanently get trapped down there unless you're particularly cruel. And then once you get Douglas back up above ground and he's having a conversation and just explaining himself, or even if he's fighting them in a not particularly menacing way, there's not really a very good horror atmosphere there. So that will be a drawback for some groups. It's also, while the investigative element is consistent with the themes of most Call of Cthulhu scenarios, the lack of good atmosphere or tension even is not consistent with that. And you want to make it clear, if this is the first scenario you run for a new player, that most Call of Cthulhu scenarios have strong horror elements than this one. You don't want them to expect everything will be like this. If you wanted to run this for a bigger group, I think you could. It might be slightly unsatisfying just because there's not a lot to do. A lot of things are just achieved through simple conversations with the non-player characters, and really that's something only one investigator can do. So you might have your investigators in excess of one standing around with less opportunities to participate. I think running it for a single investigator is really strong and potentially increases the tension a little bit just because they are on their own, and that is a little bit scarier than knowing they have other player characters around them who can, make combat rolls if they get into a tricky situation. I think the setup of the scenario is well done. You have a strong clue trail pointing to the cemetery, and then a strong clue trail within the cemetery, leading investigators into the tunnels to Douglas. For experienced players or even newer players who just understand, this is an investigative game and I need to engage with the clues. But if your player's not doing that, there is still another strong way you can have them find Douglas, and that's if they just keep it a watch on the cemetery, because they should have an intuition something to do with the cemetery is relevant, even if they're not fully engaging with all the clues, or even if they keep a watch on the home for further burglaries, because Douglas is trying to retrieve more books before the ghouls seal up the entrance to the cemetery, knowing that they've been noticed and it's best to move on because people are starting to put their noses where the ghouls don't really want them to be. So the scenario is offering you, as a keeper, a way that you are going to be able to ensure you get to the conclusion of your player figuring out that this is Douglas stealing the books, and Douglas is turning into some sort of monster, but it's a pretty morally gray situation. That's really nice for a new keeper. It's also really nice just to ensure that your players have a good experience with the scenario. They don't sit there, they're not able to figure anything out, and then you just end the scenario with no satisfying resolution for anyone, really. In terms of handouts, there are none, with the exception of a player's map of what it says is Douglas's world. So it's really just Douglas's house and a path leading to the cemetery, and the cemetery depicted on that map. There's a keeper's map with more locations noted in the scenario itself, so that is nice. In terms of both of you have a copy of the same map, the keeper's map is just better annotated. What I will say is this map is small. It makes the graveyard out to be exceptionally small, and kind of it's silly how close the mausoleum and Douglas's favorite tombstone are on the map, because the scenario calls for you to follow the tracks, but it basically puts those things right next to each other on the map. So just a thing to keep in mind. You'd probably want to describe the graveyard as being a little bit bigger and have your player have to look around a little bit more, rather than just walking 2 feet and being, oh, okay, here we go. It would also have been really good to have a map of Arnoldsburg proper included that you could just give your player, and they could see where all the locations are, where the police station is, where the Arnoldsburg advertiser is, so on and so forth. It would just give a better sense of the town to the player, and it would just help build the world a little bit better. I think this should have been included with the scenario. I also think that Douglas's journal would have made an excellent handout, and that should have been included as well. But on the upside, if you're a newer keeper, you're able to run this scenario without managing a pile of handouts that you have to remember to hand out to your players at appropriate times. So it makes things a little easier for you. I just would have liked to see the handouts, because handouts are a great part of Call of Cthulhu, and a fully fleshed out form of Douglas's journal would be really fun for the player to engage with, I think. When I ran this, my player had a good time. He was an experienced Call of Cthulhu player. I ran this when other people in the group were not available that particular week, and I just ran it for his existing character. He enjoyed it. He agreed with me. There's not a strong horror atmosphere in the scenario, but he said it was actually refreshing to not be, under physical threat, which is generally a constant theme in most Cthulhu scenarios. So he just saw it as, okay, I'm here to investigate. My character is probably not going to die. This is a good opportunity for my character to roleplay and for a character to get developed through interaction with the inhabitants of this small town, and then also through their engagement with the mystery, how they react to the various clues, what kind of actions they decide to take to investigate, because, as mentioned, there are multiple paths that can lead to you finding Douglas. And then it's a good opportunity for character development as well. At the end where you meet Douglas, and if you're some sort of monstrous or inconsiderate character, you might attack him. Another character is probably going to choose to engage with him, a more humane character, and they're going to get a better idea of what's going on. So there's a nice moral dilemma for the characters at the end. He also mentioned that, and I agree with this, that players who are all too willing to shoot up everything, this is a good scenario to drop on them, because Douglas is not really a monster. He's just a strange man who likes reading books. And if your instinct is to see he's not normal and kill him, when you realize you have killed Thomas Kimball, who perhaps is your player character's friend's relative, when you realize he was just taking his own books and he wasn't really harming anyone, that should make a player question whether their instinct to kill everything in every situation is the right thing to do. And I would encourage you to also reward them with a hefty SAN penalty, just for basically inconsiderately shooting and asking questions later, and killing not a bystander but a relatively innocent party in the process. This is also a good scenario to run for a newer player if you are looking to work that character into an ongoing campaign. Even if the player is making mistakes, taking risky decisions, it's unlikely that their character is going to end up killed in this scenario. And that's a nice thing for a newer player, to get a taste of the system without having to grab a new character immediately for the next scenario. So there you have it. There's Paper Chase. It comes in the Call of Cthulhu starter set. It is an enjoyable scenario that has good investigative elements but relatively weak horror themes. It is a strong scenario to run for a single investigator. It is a strong scenario to run in the middle of an ongoing campaign if other players can't make it. It's nice to run just as a change of pace, as a refreshing, my player character is not incredibly at risk at pretty much every moment of this scenario. That can be refreshing for your players. But it is worth noting that if this is the first scenario you run for your players, just let them know the horror atmosphere is not amazing in this one, but it will pick up in the future scenarios that you run. Just so everyone's expectations of what kind of game they're getting into are on the same page, because you don't want them thinking every scenario is just going to be a nice little investigative thing, and then you spring strong horror themes on them in the next scenario, and they weren't expecting it, and that wasn't maybe what they thought they were signing up for. So there you have it. If you've run Paper Chase, feel free to share your own thoughts or suggestions about running the scenario in the comments. If you haven't run it but have questions that I haven't addressed in this review, feel free to share those as well. And otherwise, I hope this review was useful to you. I hope my suggestions are of value. And until next time, thank you for watching and happy gaming.